Welcome to this online session, which is a York-Maastricht partnership event. My name is Peter Ball. I am from the School for Business and Society at the University of York, and I'm delighted to host this session on greener futures. We've got four exciting speakers this evening. We've got some brilliant research going on between the universities of York and Maastricht, and what we want to do is to show you how to find solutions to help transform the food system into one that is fairer, and we'll really emphasize the word fair in this, more resilient and fit for a net zero future. So just a little bit of background, the York-Maastricht partnership is a major strategic investment between the two universities, and we're going to show you the excellent sustainability research, teaching and knowledge exchange that goes on between these two institutions in two different countries. I haven't told you who's going to be part of this. So we've got four wonderful speakers coming up. We're going to alternate between York and Maastricht, and then we'll go for a panel discussion after 20 minutes. So first of all, we have got Bob Doherty talking about food system challenges. He'll be first. Then we'll move on to Clarence Bluntz on entrepreneurial innovation example number 1. We will then move on to Ulrike Ehgartner, who will give you the second entrepreneurial innovation example. And then finally, we will go to Frank Boons, who will cover food systems transformation through business model innovation. So a lot coming up and plenty for you to ask questions on. I want to keep out of your way, and I want to hand over to Bob. So Bob, over to you.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for chairing, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for giving up your evening to listen to us speak. We've got a really interesting panel for you. First of all, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Bob Doherty from the University of York, and I'm one of the research leaders in a research programme called Fix Our Food, which is about transforming the Yorkshire food system to a more regenerative food system, funded by the Transforming UK Food Systems programme. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But this is an evening really where we demonstrate our collaboration with the Sustainable Institute at Maastricht University, with Frank and Clarence, and also with Fix Our Food at York, myself and Ulrike. And we came together because we're all interested in tackling the challenges in the food system, whether they be human or planetary health challenges. And we're going to be working together for a year and beyond, really looking at how business models can innovate for greener futures by their design of their business models, and how they can have an impact on tackling these challenges in the food system. And when we mean a food system, we're talking about production all the way through to consumption and waste management and waste reuse, and all the socio-economic and all the environmental drivers that impact on that system, and the outcomes in terms of food security, environmental health, food safety, planetary health, etc. So we're looking at it as a system as a whole, and that's very, very important in the work that we do. Now, everybody is vested and has a passionate interest in the food system. You know, something we do 3 times a day. We eat food 3 times a day. And we've seen really big advances in production since the 1960s, often termed the Green Revolution. We've seen big advances in supply chain technologies and logistics. And we see some great businesses in the food system and some great farmers. Internal and this is what's brought us together, and this is why we're so interested in this research. The food system has tended to externalize its costs and create a lot of negative consequences for planetary and for human health. And just a few highlights for me and for the team here are the fact that if you just look at the United Kingdom, dietary ill health cost the UK economy £74 billion. That's in lost productivity, NHS costs, so on and so forth. It's a really, really big problem. We don't really look at the cost of it in an holistic way, in a systems way. And I'm sure those figures are also replicated in the Netherlands. And that's why we're working with Maastricht to look at how we can learn from each other across the two geographical contexts. In addition to that, in the UK, for example, 23% of primary school children enter primary school who are either obese or overweight. I mean, that's a staggering figure, 23%. If you also look at environmental negative consequences, we are now, the UK, we are bottom in terms of the G7 nations. We have the most species depleted country in the G7, and we're actually in the bottom 10% globally of species depletion. So something's going wrong with biodiversity in the United Kingdom. We see the pollution of our watercourses. We see, monocultures. We see, hedgerow depletion, all sorts of things. Obviously, there's farmers who are trying to readdress that balance, by organic and regenerative farming. But we do have a problem, and we have to face up to it. We also have a problem with soil health and soil degradation. 33% of soils in the United Kingdom are degraded. Now, that's really, really important, because where are we going to get our future food from if our soils are degraded and eroded? As Franklin D. Roosevelt said back in the 1940s, a nation that looks after its soils looks after itself. And that's really, really important. And that's why we also want to know, in this collaboration, of things that are going on in the Netherlands as well as the UK. What can we learn from each other? And how businesses and business models can actually readdress some of those and tackle some of those challenges. We also see problems in the supply chain, very well documented recently, where farmers are being exploited, whether that's internationally or in the UK, not getting a fair price for their produce. And that's replicated in places like France and the Netherlands. And that is a problem. If you want to incentivize farmers to do better things and invest in more regenerative approaches, then we have to change that system. And that's the context for why we're working together. And yeah, those are I think that's a good overview of some of the problems in the food system. And now I'm going to hand over to Clarence to kind of take us through some of his work and some examples of business model innovation that can readdress some of those food system problems. Enjoy the evening. Thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot for the introduction, Bob. So, good evening, everyone. My name is Clarence Boons. I work as a lecturer at Maastricht University, the Netherlands, and together on this project with the university, with colleagues from the University of York. So, yeah, we wanted to kick things off with two specific examples of the businesses we study, the cases that we study, to explore how can business model innovation provide answer to systemic crisis in our modern food production consumption system. So I'm going to present some of this research now, a specific case which took place in France. And I'm going to talk about how this organization, this business model, managed to correct a failure from this food production consumption system. In this case, a failure in terms of negative social impact on milk producers. So next slide, please. Thank you. So yeah, just to give you a bit of context. In the EU, but also in the UK, in most of the Western countries, since 1945, for the last 70 years, agricultural yields have increased twofold thanks to mechanization and pesticides, mostly. So that's one thing, a lot more production. The other thing is that Western countries have promoted through various policies. They have promoted low food prices through subsidies, and they have also incentivized mass production, so the increase of amounts that is being produced by farmers. The consequence of that is that we have managed to get very low prices, with household spending on food in Europe, which has decreased twofold since 1950. That is thanks to heavy subsidies from the European Union, the Common Agricultural Policy, which is still more than 40 billion euros per year and more than a quarter of the European Union budget. So this leads to overproduction and price pressure on producers, which are required to compete for lower and lower prices. So next slide, please. So this is, of course, a downward spiral, which has turned into an acute crisis many times. And for this specific example, this is in France in 2015. The end of milk quotas at this time led to a crisis of overproduction, with, as you can see on the bottom right, prices for milk going as low as 29 cents per liter paid to the producers, while producers break even closer to 45 or 50 cents per liter. And that's even taking into account the European subsidies. So a huge social impact on that, with producers who could not make a living, leading to, unfortunately, a terrible crisis with, for example, a lot of suicides in the profession. In France, one farmer commits suicide every 2 days, most of them being milk producers. So that's a huge issue. Next slide, please. So, yeah, at the height of this crisis, a social entrepreneur set up a consumer cooperative. He started online on Facebook. First, he talked with some producers, with some experts, and then he set an online survey to ask the consumers themselves, anybody, you, me, anybody could vote, to decide what a fair price for milk could be. So taking all this into account, what is a fair price for milk? So there was a survey with several items, including how much do you want to pay for the producer to be able to take some time off, for example. And this led to a milk carton, a liter of milk, which was fair milk because it pays the producer a living wage. And this is what is written in on the carton here in French, which was 20% more expensive than the competition. But with this milk, the producer could make a living. So next slide, please. The interesting thing is, of course, that despite being 20% more expensive than the competition, it was a huge success. With very little in funding and absolutely €0 spent on marketing, it all took place online on Facebook at the beginning. It was profitable from year one, so the business model in itself is financially sustainable. The brand is now present with milk, but also many other products in half of French households. There are similar initiatives with the same brand in other countries, in Germany, Spain, Greece, for example. But also what's quite interesting is that it set an example for a new regulation to be set up in France with an incentive by Emmanuel Macron, which you can see on the right. So to increase transparency on the costs of production and to communicate them to consumers. So what this cooperative did, a new law was enacted to do this across the whole food industry, across the whole supply chain. So right now they are soon going to start an experiment on this to try to expand this to other products. So this had a huge positive systemic impact, a huge positive social impact for for producers. Of course, one thing is that this example is mostly focused on social impact. So it does not really deal with the environment, but still it is interesting to see what such a business model can achieve from very humble beginnings up to huge systemic impact. So now I'm going to hand over to Ulrike, who is going to give you another example from the UK this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Clarence. So yes, I'm Ulrike Ehgartner. I'm based at the University of York, and I'm going to talk about an example of a business innovation locally to York. Next slide, please. So the context here in many ways, because food system is global and the issues are global and the same. So the context is quite similar, the background to this initiative really. So we have a situation also in the UK where there is a lot of price pressure in the food system. And what we also have is a lot of small-scale producers who, on top of struggling with this price pressure and delivering to large retailers, also are just too small to collaborate with them. And often in the way they produce food, so the agri-ecological approach that they follow, the environmentally considerate production methods are often not appreciated in the wider industrial food system. So they don't really have a place to go in many ways, and struggle to distribute their food or the products that they produce. And on top of that, some of them try, but then often have bad experiences with retailers because they don't end up delivering what retailers expect. For example, berries that are too small, or they cannot deliver the right quantities at the right time, etc., and lose contracts with retailers. So they end up being in a really vulnerable position. So what happened there in terms of innovation was that an entrepreneur, Joe Fennerty, he established this community interest company. So community interest company means that all profits that are gained from trade are reinvested in the company and the people that it supports, rather than what a bigger company would do, or a traditional company would do, of maximizing profits for its owners and shareholders. And so this initiative is based locally in York on the site of a community center in collaboration with Dunghall Community Center and the big local initiative there. And what's happening there is that a lot of growers and producers get together twice a week for a producers market where consumers from households all over York can come and buy fresh produce, but also manufacture like food that was processed in the kitchen on site. So the idea behind that is to have food available all year round. And it's a very exciting place because every day, every time the market happens, there will be different food available. And since there's also a kitchen on site, meals are being cooked with the fresh produce that comes in, and it's always different and always according to the season. And there's a very close contact between the people who visit the market and the people who sell on the market. And the model works because it's so seasonal and local, and that allows produce, even though it's super healthy and fresh and amazingly tasty, to be affordable for all the communities in York. And so what it reaches in terms of systemic impact is quite impressive, both from an environmental and a social perspective, because it allows these farmers to continue doing what they do. And so that's good for the land, it's good for biodiversity and soil health. At the same time, it allows them to have an income, and it might encourage more to switch to this kind of food production. And it's also impressive in the sense that it can offer, through its seasonal approach and being quite different, a supply chain really from farm to fork. for all kinds of products. But what is important to say here, it's a small system in itself that exists kind of alongside the mainstream system. So that's quite different in terms of its impact in comparison to the example that Clarence presented. Okay, then I leave it here and pass on to Frank.
Yes, thank you, Ulrike. Yes, so I'm going to look at it from another angle. So we had two very concrete examples of things that were developed and were successful in their own way. And part of the research that we want to do is not only to uncover such examples and look at them, but we also want to understand how they might actually sort of help a change of the whole system. And we are not able to give you sort of the definitive answers on this, but what we would like to share is, the way that we look at this sort of systems change, and use that as a starting point for the discussion. So this slide here, it basically shows, on the horizontal axis you see time. And on the vertical axis, you see sort of how much of the total system basically is affected. So if you look at the purple arrow, this is the sunrise part. So this is basically the initiatives that are sustainable, and they start very small scale, but over time they grow, they scale up in one way or another, and then at some point they basically become the new system. And what is important about this graph is that, while we tend to focus on those sort of innovations and new developments, and we want we want them to flourish and to grow, etc., etc. At the same time, what is also necessary is that we build down or somehow see the sunset of the existing system. And what this graph shows, and this is based on quite a lot of research that has been done over the last 20 years, is that if we look at this kind of systems change, is that we have distinct phases. And in those phases, we need businesses to do specific things, but we also need, for instance, governments to support this with quite specific policy interventions. So if you give one more click, then those become visible as well, I think, yes. So I'm not going to talk all through this because that's, we can get into that if people are interested in it. So just to link this picture to the two examples that we just heard, in a way, you could say that the example that Clarence has presented about the milk is an example that starts, as a sort of small-scale initiative, very localized, but through the use of Facebook and also by, in a way, sort of making use of the existing price mechanism, it is able to scale up quite easily, because once you have not sort of a market price, but a negotiated price where consumers are actually able to voice their opinion about what the price could be, then you're in a way making use of the market and the price mechanism, but in a alternative way, and that allows it to scale up quite easily. And then at some point you see that the government policy also supports that. The question about this kind of example is, this works for milk. Well, then the next question is, okay, how can it transform the whole food system? So that basically means that you would like, that we would want to see to what extent this kind of a mechanism, where consumers basically negotiate and discuss and have a dialogue about what is a fair price, whether that can be extended to other products. The second example presented by Ulrike it has a totally different quality in the sense that it's very systemic. And it really sort of tries to encompass the whole food system in a way, but that's very localized. And we had discussions with farmers and other sort of representatives of the food system. And basically the question there is, how can you grow this, or how can you scale this up? And if we would scale it up in the sense of making it bigger, growing it, then that might very very well leads to a system that's very similar to the one that we already have. So basically, that system works and is sustainable because it's small scale. And then that implies that rather than scaling up these kind of examples, it is a question of replicating them. So having local initiatives in all kinds of other places. Because at the moment you could say that these local systems, they are on the left, sort of bottom side of the purple arrow, and the gray arrow still is very much sort of the existing system which is in place. And you could ask the question to what extent we are really moving towards sort of this point where these localized systems are actually sort of replacing the existing system. And this is a matter of, whether it's possible to do this in different localities, but this is also a question about price. So if you would, have these localized sort of supply chains, very often they have a higher price. And at some point, that means that it's not available for everybody anymore. So in that sense, the example that Ulrike presented is quite unique because there, actually the accessibility is quite good. But in many other cases, these localized offerings in the food system, they actually come at a premium price, which raises questions about accessibility. That's the way that we currently frame our research on business models and try to link it to systems change. And maybe here it's good to hand back to Peter to start a discussion about what these business models actually can mean and whether they can lead us to systems change.
Thank you very much, all. That was wonderful, really, really interesting. I think it's great at the beginning that Bob gave us a picture of all of the things that are bad about the way we currently do things, but gave us optimism. And then we went on to Clarence and Ulrike, who then gave us examples of how things worked, of how we as I really like Bob's beginning part where he talked about, well, we're all involved in food. We have 3 meals a day. And then Clarence talked about when if we were in France, we would go and buy a certain brand of milk, or if we were in York, then with Ulrike's example, we'd go to Tang Hall, and then Frank wrapping it all up and saying, well, this is part of an overall change. So I would like to ask a question of my own before we move on. I'm going to direct this to Bob, and then I'll go through some of the questions that we've got coming up. And Bob, you started off with a lot of negative things about what was wrong at the farm, what was wrong with health, and you talked about the health service and so forth. You came up with all these problems, and I just wanted to know, do we have to tackle one problem at a time and tick those off, or is there a way of having a change that actually it tackles them together at the same time?
It's a great question, and I do think, and I would say this being a systems person, I think some of these problems are interconnected. So if I take the production of fruit and vegetables in the UK, and that obviously has an impact, positive impact in terms of fibre and nutrient consumption on dietary health, has a positive impact, and the government did say in its food strategy last summer that it would develop an horticultural strategy for the UK, which would scale up the production of fruit and vegetables, and get those fruit and vegetables into disadvantaged neighbourhoods as well, to improve dietary health and reduce the cost of dietary ill health. It's so needed in the UK. Yet they've U-turned on the horticultural strategy recently. I don't know why, because if you look at the level of imports, we import over 50% of our vegetables in the UK, and I'm talking about the UK now. This could also be replicated in other country contexts as well. And we import 84% of our fresh fruit in the UK. And there is an opportunity to scale up our own fruit and vegetable production, which would have a positive impact on the nation's health. So that's an area where production and consumption are definitely connected.
Okay, thank you. One of the questions that we've got in the chat, and Clarence, you talked about how the production of milk involved a democratic way and involving people and their choices. And there's a question quite early on about if you're a consumer, you walk into a shop and you're overwhelmed by what you see, and an individual consumer can feel overwhelmed of what choices they should make. But you said you conveyed the principle of that it's us as consumers, as buyers, who are making the change. And I just wondered whether you got any advice for the second question that came up about how can we improve our buying behavior as individuals?
Well, that's a very, very important question, of course. So on the one hand, if we can, of course, we should strive to think a bit more about our choices in terms of consumption. This is not possible for everyone. Of course, there are issues with the amount of money you can spend on more responsible products, of course. The amount of time you can spend on this. But in the case I studied, we saw that with a limited amount of information, basically just the presence of the brand on Facebook and the media was enough to create trust with consumers. One of the interesting insights from this case is that most of the people I talked to did not know exactly what the brand, the cooperative entailed, like what was the questionnaire about. They just knew either from word of mouth or from the media that this initiative was working well. If we had more examples of business model innovations such as this, we could solve part of the equation. But of course, consumers cannot be responsible for everything. Again, I spoke of we have a limited amount of time available, we have a limited amount of money available. So it cannot only be up to consumers to change it. Of course, we cannot spend like 12 hours every day in a supermarket looking at cost of production. But in this French example, what was interesting is that the cooperative set an example to which was then used to change the regulation, and then the same example can be applied to other companies to force other companies to change. So in this case, the consumers set up the first, they took the first step, and then the state, the government was able to carry on and increase the scope of the impact, basically.
Okay. And there was a question about the profitability of that fair price, and it was and what was the main reason why it was profitable. And I'm getting the sense from what you're saying is that people have this idea of fairness, that whilst they might want cheap food, they also want it to be fair, cheap food.
Yeah, exactly. Something very interesting in this case is that this cooperative, this organization, succeeded in transforming something that was taken for granted in this industry, in the fast-moving consumer good industry, which is that consumers only want the lowest prices, and you are not going to succeed if you just sell the same product 20% more expensive. And there is nothing more similar to milk than some other milk, but still they managed to sell this 20% more expensive milk with a huge success. It was the fastest growth for a new brand in this sector in France for the past 30 years. So I think in this case it worked. I mean, of course, we try to analyze and figure out the many reasons as to why it worked. It was kind of a perfect storm, of course. But fairness is important here. As I mentioned, it's about positive social impact rather than environment impact, and I think this plays a role. Consumers were able to identify to these farmers, right? They were basically just people like you and me that we needed to help. Basically, that was a big part of why this worked. why? So yes, the fairness aspect is extremely important.
Wonderful. And there's a question that I'm going to ask to Ulrike first, and then I'll leave for Frank to do a follow-up to it. There's a question about the town hall example, which I've been there, and I can vouch for the food being absolutely wonderful. There's a question about scale up. This was one example in one city, but Ulrike, to you first, and then on to Frank straight afterwards about how do you make these small successes much bigger?
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, so it might require a way to think about scaling up differently. Because lots, and it's not only Food Circle, but a lot of organizations that we are working with that say they don't actually want to grow in the sense of becoming bigger and having more income as an organization. Two approaches here to think about it differently is, and that was mentioned by Frank before already, is to copy the concept so that others do the same elsewhere. So people in this kind of community, in this food producers community, are often quite open to share their experiences and their knowledge, and others are can have access to this information and try to establish something on their own. But now relating back to what Bob said earlier, there is an issue with availability and with the extent to which we actually grow quality food in the UK. So skills and resources need to be built at the same time as business models around it. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, so at the moment they're cooking for breakfast clubs, and while the market is on, but that's just on particular occasions in the week. But another way of scaling would be to bring this concept actually into hospitality. So into restaurants and into public procurement as well. So if schools, for example, adopt to this kind of food, that would create a change as well, and at the same time reach people from across the society. An issue that we have there is that highly local means highly seasonal, and that means that we have certain vegetables really just for a few weeks a year. Some we might never have because they don't grow in the UK. And it requires really to reformulate the meals. And it's a completely different experience for us as consumers than going to a restaurant or going to the canteen in our workplace or in our schools.
And Frank, you presented the graphs of expanding and accelerating, and I just wondered how you would respond to the same question about how do you take something like the town hall example and have something similar or duplicated or just same principles?
Yeah, so I mean that's, for me, that's also in part a question in not only in the sense of how do you replicate, because I mean that's what Ulrike said. I mean I hinted at that too. So I definitely think that there is not so much in terms of growing the same business or the same activity, in terms of scale, but replicating it. An obvious question there is that part of the success of the last 70 years is that actually the economies of scale made it possible to feed sort of the world population, right? So we shouldn't forget that the current system that we have, in fact, comes out of a solution to a question about feeding a very, very quickly growing world population. And obviously that, now we see sort of the negative side effects of that. But if we go back to small scale food production, then there is a question whether we can actually feed everybody. And that's something that we really need to take, we need to sort of not forget about that, let's put it that way, because otherwise we sort of fool ourselves. So part of the answer, I think, is also, or part of the thing to learn from that example is, this is happening at the community center. So this is very much so. I mean, the earlier question was about, how can we sort of shape or change the buying behavior of consumers? I think that's sort of the question, sort of putting it slightly wrong, not in the sense of making the consumer responsible, but in sort of making the buying behavior sort of the key thing. And I don't think the buying behavior is the key thing. The key thing is, how do people eat? How do they eat together? How do they share meals and things like that? And how do they learn from each other in doing that? And so that is something where I think it's really important. If we want to change our diet, then this is about more than just what we do when we are in the supermarket, right? So it's really about much more than that. And interestingly, there's also, here is sort of interesting examples where business models and artificial intelligence and stuff like that, I mean, they sort of come together. So I know of research that people are doing where they're developing apps where you basically say, I want to cook this meal. And then the app gives you sort of the ingredients that are actually sort of the sustainable ingredients. Let's put it that way. So rather than you buying ingredients that that you feel you need to have, which might have a footprint, it actually gives you alternative ingredients that have a much lower carbon footprint, for instance. So this is this is an example where we use sort of digital technology. We bring together information, which is really important, but we bring it together in a meaningful way. So it's not on a label on a product, but rather it's sort of in terms of telling you how to cook a certain recipe. And those kind of things I think are really interesting. And that's where sort of more meaningful information and a business sort of approach can actually come together.
Thank you, Frank. I've got so many questions here and so little time to get around them, but I want to go back to Ulrike and the Town Hall example. And those are the question about serving a diverse community. To what extent does your example serve a diverse community? Because we've been talking about fairness in our presentations, but what about those who can't easily get to a community site because they're disabled or income poor? Have you got any thoughts around that really broad aspect of access?
So, yeah, I mean, it's not perfect, but because nowhere it's perfect, but they do the best that is possible by placing themselves in an income poor neighborhood, in a location, in a community center that is already attended by people who are income poor, and also serving people who can afford to pay a premium for the products. So a lot of it works by people on higher salaries kind of subsidizing for people on lower salaries. Surely not everybody in the community is being reached. The disability aspect, I mean, that's, I don't know what the context of this question is, but I guess online deliveries are one way to reach people and make it accessible to them. But that's, I guess that's something that is an aspect that concerns all sorts of businesses. But there is an issue with good food often just being accessible to people who are on higher salaries, and also to people who have this concept of wanting to buy this food. I think there's also even a sort of a stigma around organic, and a misconception both amongst those who choose not to consume it and those who choose to consume it. So that the kind of a positive bias towards organic also by those who buy it. So there's a lot to discuss in relation to that.
Okay, thank you very much. I wanted to go back to Bob, and there was an early question about tax and labeling and sort of forcing the issue. And I wondered, Bob, what your views were about how much you encourage people in their behaviors and how much you tell people or you tell organizations this is the way.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there needs to be a mix of mechanisms and a more coherent approach. I mean, I think we've got to get away from this mindset that taxes are bad and have a more positive attitude towards tax. And actually, in the independent review carried out by Henry Dimbleby, the UK National Food Strategy, they recommended a mandatory tax on those companies, a 2% tax actually, on those companies who were producing high-fat, sugar-salt foods, which were creating a lot of health disparities and dietary ill health in the UK. But it was refuted by government. And the government misunderstood it because government thought it was actually a tax on consumers. It wasn't. It's actually a tax on companies. And we need to be more creative when it comes to tax. And that tax was going to be used to get healthy food, fresh produce, into disadvantaged communities, a bit like the food circle example, but on a national scale. And it would have been a mechanism to fund that. And I don't know why. I'm at a loss, really, as to why that wasn't taken up. Because it was, I mean, if you look at what's happened in London, Sadiq Khan has used the business tax, the business rate, to fund free school meals for all primary school children in London. That's a creative use of tax. So we need to be much more creative and redistribute wealth across the UK and France and Netherlands and globally, really, to tackle these problems, systemic problems in the food system.
Thank you very much, and I like your example about the London school food, because it's been done in a highly equitable, no stigma attached way. Mm-hmm. But Clarence, I wanted to go to you, because how much are we talking? Because you've moved around in different countries, and you might have views from France, from the Netherlands, views from the UK. How much of what we're talking about is representative of the globe? Because there was a question about of any figures that we use. Is this particular to companies, or is this you just take the developed world or the world completely? As in, have you got any comments about how this might vary by country or by continent?
Well, I think we are seeing similar things across Western countries, so the EU, the UK, North America, etc. I think the problems in the rest of the world are actually quite different and probably need to be tackled differently. I've worked mostly on EU countries, so I cannot say a lot about this. But yeah, for example, the economic system that we've built in Europe and in the rest of the developed world has a huge negative impact on southern countries, obviously, because we have massive agriculture and a production that is massively subsidized. Which means that we are creating unfair competition for farmers in the south. We cannot compete with the subsidized product from the north. We are exporting, for example, powdered milk from the EU in Africa, which is a problem. Yeah, and I think I'm not sure about the exact figure, unfortunately, but I think that globally half of the people who are suffering from hunger globally are actually farmers, which shows you how this issue impacts farmers. So yeah, the Western world certainly has to set an example and to think about the impacts and consequences of the economic system that we have created and that we continue to maintain. The impact not only on our own countries but also in the global south.
Thank you very much. There's a question I'm now going to put to Frank, because there's a question about how do you think the mainstream supermarkets could make food consumption more sustainable, and that in some ways, or maybe it doesn't. Frank, you had a graph where you talked about the growth of a new way of doing things and a decline of an old way, and I think if I remember rightly, that you were removing the incumbents, or you were changing the incumbents. So the question to you is, how much of the existing players in how we get food are part of the solution, or they're permanently part of the problem, as in they have to be taken along with us, or they have to be removed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's really a key question. It's also very difficult to answer that question in sort of any sort of general and definitive way, I would say. I mean, supermarkets are interesting in the sense that they, what I've seen. So, I mean, I did my PhD too long ago to remember actually, but when I was looking at certain types of packaging which contain PVC and CFCs and stuff like that, so that gives you a rough idea when that was. And then actually supermarkets, they were quite responsive to sort of to demand from consumers to remove those kind of products. So supermarkets in themselves, they don't necessarily want to sell certain things rather than others. I mean, they just want to sell stuff, right? So in that sense, you could argue that retailers are, could be sort of an incumbent that can actually sort of facilitate change. That sort of leaves aside, or that sort of ignores the point that those kind of retailers, they operate at a certain scale, and in that sense, they they might sort of require certain supply chains that are not really where it's very difficult to actually sort of be sustainable. I mean, if you look in different countries, then you see that mainstream supermarkets have sort of very differential sort of offerings of options that are organic or sustainable or healthy, etc., etc. So to me, that suggests that that within certain national contexts, supermarkets are actually able to contribute to that change. And if you look over time, in France, but also in the Netherlands and in the UK, I think that's also slowly starting. You see that supermarkets over time have more and more sort of the products that we would want to see there. So in that sense, I'm not sure whether we would want to get rid of supermarkets, or that supermarkets that are at the root of the problem. Let's put it that way. But I mean, it does require a little bit of a more than just serving the customer. One of the things that I found in the research that I did is that supermarkets are quite keen to sort of follow consumers when they demand environmentally friendly products and packaging and stuff like that. If that sort of public interest sort of dies away a little bit, then the supermarkets also, their interest also dies away. So a little bit more commitment to values rather than just serving the customer, that sometimes can help. So yeah, the answer to the question whether supermarkets can be part of the solution very much is a function of those points that I mentioned, I would say.
Thank you very much. And we were just picking on one particular part of what is a very industrialized food production process there, and I have missed out so many really wonderful questions, and I apologize we couldn't get through them all, but we do have questions about the industrialization of farming and the loss of variety in our food. Huge problem with food waste. There's questions about blockchain, following on from points about use of digital and the use of food banks. So I apologize we couldn't get through all of these, but it just shows that the breadth of the challenges that we have here. We are coming to the end of the session, so I am rudely not going to ask anybody else any more questions, but it's been a wonderful session. Thank you to Bob, to Ulrike, to Frank, and to Clarence you've given us some great insight into the fairness of an agreeing a future. And it's been a wonderful demonstration of a partnership between the University of York and Maastricht University. So it's been great having you here. Thank you very much. And to the audience, thank you. And also sorry, because we couldn't get through your wonderful questions. Thank you all very much once again for being part of this session. It's been really interesting. So thank you very much all.